In some ways, the economic story of the last few decades has been a very positive one. There's been a tremendous amount of global growth. The world as a whole grew faster between 2003 and 2007 than ever before. But at the same time, inequality within countries has been rising. So if you look statistically, 70% of people around the world are now living in countries and in societies where there is a greater percentage of inequality than there was 20 years ago. So this is obviously a huge issue. It has economic impacts, social impacts, cultural impacts, and it impacts the ability of people to get a leg up. Inequality and mobility are very connected, as I'm sure many of you know. This is an issue that is a major headwind to growth, to business, to social cohesiveness, and I think almost every news story that you can point to right now in the world, from what's happening in Europe to the partisan politics here in the US, to some of the issues in China and the emerging markets reflect this. So we have this amazing panel here today to discuss it. And we're going to do this in kind of a timeline that will take the life cycle of a person. So we're going to go from maternal health and nutrition to early childhood to youth unemployment to workforce development, and kind of look at these issues and give hopefully a good overview, a quick overview, but start a conversation about this that all of you can continue. So I'm going to start with Professor Joe Stiglitz, who is obviously one of the foremost thinkers, academics, writers in this area. And Joe, maybe if you could take a minute and tell us why this matters so much. Why does inequality matter from an economic point of view? Why does it matter politically? Why does it matter socially?
Well, yeah, this was the central theme of my book, both The Great Divide and The Price of Inequality. It used to be thought that there were trade-offs, that if you wanted to have less inequality, you'd have to give up on economic performance. And now we realize that actually inequality is bad for economic performance. And this is not just, you might say, a left-wing view. This has really become a mainstream view, with the IMF pointing out that, especially in the extremes of inequality that are found in the United States and many other countries, and the way that inequality is generated, it is bad both for growth and stability. But there's another side of it that is really related to what we're going to be talking about today, which is inequality of opportunity, which is sort of a basic, I would say, American value, basic Western value. And what we now know is that countries, or even parts of the country, where there is much higher level of inequality, tend to have very low levels of equality of opportunity. So the United States, which always does things bigger and better than other countries, has achieved bigger, has achieved the highest level of inequality among any of the advanced countries. And at the same time, we have among the lowest levels of equality of opportunity. And that's so against the view that we have of ourselves and others have of us, of the American dream. And those two ideas are actually very connected.
I'm going to jump in one quick question. Is there any way to quantify, this is probably too simplistic a question, but can you quantify what that does for growth in this country? I mean, that sense that we don't have mobility anymore, that we're behind Europe, we're behind a lot of countries in that respect, what that means for US business competitiveness and growth overall.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely clear that it slows down economic growth. And the obvious reason for this is, think about it very simply, the most important resource of any country are its human resources, its people. And if the people at the bottom don't have the opportunity to live up to their potential, the country is not going to be living up to the potential. So, just to put this in terms of statistics, the United States has the life prospects of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in other advanced countries. So I tell my students the most important decision that you can take is choosing the right parent.
That's a bummer. This is reminding me, what you just said about human capital is actually reminding me, I had a conversation with the head of Aetna a few months ago, and he was making a very interesting point. He was saying that, the world right now is awash in capital. The businesses are often taught, and people are taught when they get an MBA, to marshal their capital and don't think that much about labor. But what you're saying is we've moved to a different world in which labor is the asset. And so if you don't marshal that, that has huge, not only macroeconomic impact, but just, for every business, that's a huge issue.
Absolutely. I mean, and the real problem for our society today, and we'll come back to talk this, I think, in the panel, is a few years ago, Ben Bernanke was talking about a savings glut, that there was too much capital. And I look around the world, and I see the needs to invest in people, in infrastructure, in mitigating in climate change, retrofitting the world for climate change. The issue is not that there's a savings glut. The real problem is, how do we take all the capital and put it to good use, including investing in people?
And create real growth and productivity and jobs, not just virtual growth. All right, so much more to talk about. I feel like we need a whole other panel on this. But Jessica, I want to come to you because you are kind of at the work that you're doing is really at the base of this pyramid, this life cycle that we're talking about. Your work with woman care, and I want you to tell us just what that's all about, how you got interested in maternal health, pregnancy, and equal opportunity.
Well, don't ask her about pregnancy. That's private. How she got involved in her pregnancy.
It's not private anymore. We know she's had a baby, and she looks fantastic, by the way.
Thank you. And I mean, that's so interesting that you said the word private, because that's really what we want to do with this campaign, which we're calling, Then Who Will, which comes from the phrase, if you don't tell them, then who will? And that really refers to parents speaking to children, peers speaking to peers, partners speaking to partners, whomever. It's really about education and educating and pulling women's issues out of the shadows, pulling women's reproductive issues really specifically out of the shadows.
And we were talking earlier, I mean, it didn't dawn on me until you said it, but this idea that, all right, so both of us grew up in the US in an affluent society, in homes where there was opportunity and people were talking. Neither of us, and very few others, I think, got any formal understanding of your own cycle, pregnancy, how this might affect you health-wise, physiologically. Tell us why that understanding, both in a rich country like this, but also internationally, is important in terms of equality and opportunity.
Well, I mean, education for everyone is empowerment, and if we can provide the access and the resources for the correct information and the correct education, not only women, but everyone can choose to better their life and make the right decisions for themselves and their families. I mean, that's proven throughout the world. When you give specifically women these abilities to have access to the right information, they then always choose to make these amazing decisions for themselves and their families.
So is early pregnancy generally connected with lower mobility? I mean, is that something that is, managing that, link that up for us with inequality and mobility? When a girl gets pregnant early or doesn't understand about maternal care, what's the fallout of that?
Well, when you don't make the decision yourself to start a family, if you're not saying, I choose this and I want to do this, it changes the trajectory of their life tenfold. I mean, there's a staggering statistic in this country, actually, that I believe it's half of the pregnancies in this country every year are unintended, which is absolutely staggering to me. And I think the reason this is that this issue struck me as so important to talk about and get involved in is when I decided to, when I was thinking about having my own family, and I started to learn about, okay, so I need to now get off birth control, and does it just happen? Is it just that easy? What do I do? And I started to read this incredible book that taught me about my personal, cycle, and I had no idea any of these things that I was reading, and I just felt so embarrassed, and I felt I couldn't believe that I grew up just like you know, in a place that has access to all of this information, and I knew nothing.
So who do you think should be helping us get that information to young girls, to women? Should that be a public sector thing? What can the private sector do, if anything, in this respect, do you think? What can companies do?
Well, I think at least what Women Care Global is trying to do is to say, let us be the curator of resources. Let us drive you to the places that you can get the correct information. I think a big problem is, you know, in the education sector, because half of the states in this country don't even have sex education in their public schools, and even less than half have to be actually medically and technically accurate.
Wow.
Which is really, really also shocking.
That is amazing. Well, and that kind of tees up that incredible statistic that you gave earlier about half of pregnancies being unplanned. Bob, I want to actually come to you and have you jump in, because you work in Africa, you're in the telecoms and internet business. You actually have developed a tool that might be used in terms of information dissemination, not just about maternal health or early childhood, but really about anything. Can you kind of walk us through that and tell folks how that works?
Yeah, let me paint the picture. You know, we've made some good progress on the Millennium Development Goals, and we've seen an improvement in maternal mortality rate, an improvement in early childhood mortality. But having said that, even today, out of every 100 children that are born live, 5 of them will not make it to 5. And that's a very high statistic. Similarly, with maternal mortality, we're getting a rate of 400, which has improved from the 460 that died. So against that background, we as a company said, what can we do to help fix this? How can we use the technology we've got? And so we've worked with to develop an application, which is loaded onto a simple smartphone which is about $50. And it helps community health extension workers, some of whom are just volunteers, to register mothers when they become pregnant. And for many of these women, this is the first time there would be any record of them.
Huh, that's interesting.
So it registers them, it registers where they are in their pregnancy, and we then send messages. And actually, I know you told me to leave my phone behind, but
but you work in telecoms, so
these are not smartphones. These are the simplest $10 phones. And we send to the mothers a reminder to go to their antenatal, because if you go to at least 4 antenatal sessions, you have a much better chance of survival. And so we send them a simple text message. And even after the birth, we then send them reminders to take the children for their inoculations, because, honestly, if someone sends you a message, it just tells you that somebody cares, and therefore I'll do it.
It's a nudge.
It's a nudge. And we track those children for the first 5 years. And it's for the first time the government of Kenya is able to track those people in the most remote areas.
I have to just say, it is amazing to me in the era of big data that what you're talking about, that this information hadn't been recorded, that it hadn't been registered till now, that this is, that this is the first time that this is all being collated. That's fantastic. It's an amazing opportunity. I want to come back to what's happening in Africa, and in particular the way that technology is being applied there, because it's actually, I'm sure many of you have worked in Africa, incredibly vibrant place in terms of tech development and how technology is being used for social applications, in many ways in more innovative manners than it is even in the developed world. But we're going to break in just a couple of things. Jessica, I know you are actually going to, sadly, have to leave us because you have to go do more work on Good Morning America, publicizing women care, talking about your mission. So thank you for being with us here for a little bit of time, and good luck with that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Education is, of course, a piece of the inequality conversation that comes up a lot. It's often referred to in very kind of long-term, nebulous ways. We all know that education has to be a part of the solution, and I want to delve in just a moment deeply into that. But first, I actually want to ask you a question that I've been wanting to ask since Jessica was speaking about health issues earlier. Early childhood nutrition issues. This is something that you've thought about a lot. That's something that's actually part of the education conversation as well, because a lot of kids are being fed in school or not in some cases. Tell us a little bit about nutrition. I know it's something you've studied. Why is that important in terms of getting children where they need to be to do the learning that you're talking about?
Well, nutrition for children at the very, very beginning, in the first 1,000 days actually, is so essential, because that's the time when the brain develops. And if you don't get the right nutrition, you simply reduce the child's capacity, brain capacity, and ability to learn by 20%. So in those first 1,000 days, you can really make a difference with the right nutrition and the right,
You know, Joe, this is making me think too. Joe did this amazing policy paper recently for the Roosevelt Institute that really links up a lot of this stuff and looks at policies, not just economic policies, but in healthcare and education. And I mean, how important is this piece of the puzzle? This idea that kids are basically not even getting the nutrients that they need to learn, and what would be a great lever for that, either in the public sector or the private sector? Do you think?
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about the importance, and we've got a little bit of our own history. We discovered in World War II that as they drafted everybody into the Army in the United States, that the incidence of malnutrition was very high. And that was part of the origin of the school lunch program. So here we think of ourselves as a rich country, and even in this rich country, there's a lot of malnutrition. Not a surprise, especially right now with the degree of inequality that we have, with basically about 1 out of 7 Americans on food stamps, not able to buy enough food. About 1 out of 7 Americans are facing, you might say, nutritional deficiency, which means they go to bed hungry at least once a month, not because they're on a diet, but because they can't afford adequate food. And again, you know, you might say it's outrageous, unconscionable in a country as rich as us, where our farmers are producing more food than an obese society can consume, and yet there are large fractions of our population who don't get access to adequate food.
Well, and also, I mean, the way we create food and industrial farming also play, I mean, we could have a whole other panel on that and why that's connected to inequality. And,
and a lot of this goes back to education of what is nutritional food.
Yes.
As you know, there's been a major battle even on the question of making sure that there are nutritional lunch programs. During the Reagan administration, they decided, you know, we had a regulation saying that school lunches ought to have at least 2 vegetables. And I don't remember, they reclassified ketchup and mustard as the 2 vegetables. So, you know, with that kind of mentality, obviously, we have a problem.
Yes, it's funny. This is reminding me of a childhood log I had to do about food groups, and that had been a really busy week for my mom. And she's like, "Popcorn? Can we count that as a vegetable?" Anyway, working mom. Bob, talk to us a little bit about how this plays out in the emerging world. I mean, it must be a huge issue there in terms of nutrition, education, opportunity.
It's a massive issue. I mean, you started out by talking about inequality, and inequality in an African context is a real big deal. And you have to imagine, you know, when Joe talked about the percentage of people who go to bed hungry at least once a month, we think about the percentage of people who go to bed every night. But coming back to the technology, and you know, you asked earlier about what are the kind of stuff we're doing. You know, there's a level of trust, which, and Jessica talked about, you know, no one tells you. And for people to go in a white coat to tell a mother, a pregnant woman, what to do, she's not going to listen. So you have to work with people in the community. And what we have done is we've trained the people in the community. And the people in the community sometimes are illiterate. So how do you train them? You train them by using a phone. And immediately when I say phone, everyone in this room thinks a smartphone. And it isn't. You train them by speaking to them. Because actually that's the way we learn to communicate before we learn to write. And so we have community volunteers who are scattered around the area, and they dial in and they have someone teach them using the phone. If they want to ask a question, then they press 1 or 2 and we know exactly who you are, and then you get the answers. And that has proven to be enormously successful, not just in rural areas, but also in slum areas. And we have other stuff that we do. If you take TB, to treat a TB tuberculosis patient costs about $90. And the problem with TB is that you can get better much quickly, but actually it hasn't cured the problem. And so you stop taking the medication. The result is you then get a multi-drug resistance strain of TB. And when you do that, that $90 cost moves up to $20,000. In African contexts, you can't afford to do that. And so how do we deal with that? We use the mobile phone and we track your adherence to drugs. And a lot of the reasons why they don't, in addition to the fact that they just feel better and they stop taking it, is because they can't afford to take the public transport to get to the clinic, to get to the drugs. And so we say, if you take your drugs, we will send you the money using M-Pesa, which is this mobile money thing that we have in Kenya. We will send you the money for the fare via the phone. That dramatically reduces the incidence of, or the growth of multi-drug resistance. And so, we believe that the technology has the capacity to really bridge those gaps and to really make some big shifts.
All right, I want to come back to the employment issue, and I want to tackle a little bit more the youth unemployment problem that we were talking about, and then maybe go on to some of these broader issues that Art was flicking at. Joe, the youth unemployment issue is really, it's across the board, right? This is not a poor country thing. This is everybody is having this problem, right?
That's right, but it's obviously much worse in some countries. It correlates very heavily with the overall unemployment rate. So typically, you can say twice the ordinary unemployment rate. So you look at Europe, where the average unemployment rate is around 12, the youth unemployment is around 25%. You look at Greece, where the unemployment rate is 25%, the youth unemployment rate is between 50 and 60%. But what you're doing there is you're really destroying a whole generation. We all speak about lifetime learning. That, as you mentioned, the most important learning often occurs outside of the formal structure, and the formal structure provides the context in which all the other learning. And the most important part, or at least a very important part of lifetime learning, is on-the-job learning. But if there's no jobs, there's no on-the-job learning. Yeah. And so, when I look, say, at Europe as just one example, what they are doing by this extended period of slow growth, stagnation, high unemployment, is destroying their human capital. Yeah. And lowering potential growth.
Yeah, that's interesting. That kind of 2-to-1 ratio is amazing. Hanne, you were nodding. Do you see this trend where you are?
Well, 6 months ago, I was the COO, Chief Operating Officer of SOS Children's Villages International. And one of the things we were more concerned about than many other things was employability. And how could we actually help the young people move into employment? Because as you say, there's a lot of learning you have to do in the early years. When you become older, it's difficult to integrate into a workplace. But also, if you don't get that first job, if you don't see that you can provide value, then you start losing the confidence that you can actually make a difference. And that loss takes, that confidence gap is extremely difficult to overcome later, and actually, if there are opportunities at a later stage, to get engaged and get involved.
Can I just make one statistic that sort of illustrates this? Yeah. Children who graduate, say, from college, say in the United States, if they graduate in a period in which there's high unemployment, so they don't get a job, their lifelong economic opportunities are much lower. They never make up for what they lose. So the fact is that if in those first year or 2 or 3 years they don't get a job, it's basically real lost opportunities. It's not only they lose those 3 years, but their whole trajectory is lowered.
And this is a huge issue for the millennials, obviously, who came of age post-crisis, taking on record amounts of student debt. Student debt is now a bigger bubble than credit card debt. And these kids are just saddled with this. Let me add, I'm gonna be a little bit of a devil's advocate here and ask you all how much you think the private sector can get involved in education in terms of solving this problem. I mean, there's been some really interesting and innovative examples. Even just here in New York City, IBM actually helped start a school in Crown Heights that is creating a kind of a workforce learning curriculum. Kids that graduate come out with an associate's degree, they get a job, they're guaranteed a job at IBM. On the other hand, some folks would say, you know what, the private sector really should not be that much in education. Bob, do you have a thought on this?
Yeah, so let me start in a different place. And let me pick up from where Joe left off just now. And we talk about all the kids who are graduating from college. And we are stuffing children into college, and they are ending up with a massive debt. And they're ending up driving an Uber car. You know, I was having dinner with some people last night who talked about that his driver, who said her boyfriend, who graduated, you know, incurred all kinds of debt, is now applying to drive a car. And I speak as someone who actually don't have a degree and never went to college, but still run the biggest company in East Africa. So there's this urge to keep shoving them into that formal tertiary education and not training them to be drivers and plumbers and electricians and all those other things that we also need. So that's my first thing. But then let's just go back to the earlier education. The kind of things that we are able to do in Kenya is you know, the teacher-student ratio is about 50 to 1, which means you really are not going to get you know, any kind of individual attention. There's also a huge lack of training materials. And so we come back to our good old friend, the mobile phone. And we, you know, mobile phones now are more ubiquitous than probably any other thing. I mean, more people have access to mobile phones than to water or to toilets. Toilets is one of those things which is now a luxury in large parts of the world, whereas it shouldn't be. And so we use the mobile phone to deliver lessons at the cost of about 50 cents a week. And today, having partnered with one of a small Kenya startup, today we have about 375,000 people who subscribe to this thing every week. These are the kinds of things. We have one of the largest refugee camps in Africa, in Kenya, Dadaab, home to some 380,000 people, I think. And we have now put an instant network into that place. We've given the children tablets. They now have access to all the information in the world. And these children have moved from 19th century education, because in a refugee camp, you're not allowed to put up permanent structures. It has to be tarpaulin. We've moved them from 19th century education to 21st century education, reaching 180,000 children
That's
today.
the scale of that is amazing. Hanne, let me ask you, what do you think about that kind of online learning, more learning on demand? Would that train up the kind of people that you would hire?
Well, online learning, I think, is really, really great because it creates much bigger reach. So that being said, I would also then please allow me to change the direction slightly, because on the other hand, what we are really focusing on, and what I would urge private sector to get much more involved in and take much more interest in, is the early learning. This is because it's really clear that money for education is always scarce. And you can prove that money invested in the early years, early learning, is so much more worth. The ROI, the return on investment, is simply higher than what you would get if you invest in the later years. And what happens in most systems is that the public sector, for good reasons, politicians for good reasons, have a focus on the last years, because that's when they feel that the workforce needs to be prepared. And may I just make just a very brief comment? So in the beginning of this phase, you can really make the investment, and that's not online. That's person to person with young children.
Joe, what do you think about that?
Well, first I want to say there are aspects like development in technology, like you're talking about. There are aspects like the development, the MOOCs, which can bring knowledge to, you know, all around the world at a very high level. On the other hand, we also have to remember the worst players in American, particularly tertiary education, university education, are the for-profit companies. They've been really exploiting the poorest Americans. And this has been a problem for more than a quarter century. When I was in the Clinton administration, we knew about the problem. We tried to get regulations passed. They use the power of lobbying to be able to continue exploiting the poorest Americans, charging high tuition, no education. Most of the kids wind up with large amounts of debt. You're talking the most indebted kids get out of these for-profit schools, and they don't get jobs.
Right.
So it seems to me that one of the things that we should do is make sure the private sector doesn't do any harm, and we start regulating them, because this is really one of our most important problems in the United States.
We need a Hippocratic oath maybe for education.
Yeah.
But
Go
not
ahead,
only
Bob.
to make sure the private sector doesn't do any harm, because I'm here to defend the private sector, also making sure the public sector do their job. Actually, it's government's role to educate its people, not the private sector.
We might have to have like a clap off to see who thinks which sector. I mean, actually, Bob, that kind of brings up an important point. And I know you have a lot of views on corruption and on public sector corruption, particularly in the developing world. And the fact that a lot of governments in some of the richest countries, I'm thinking about Nigeria just because I spent some time there, are not doing their jobs in this area. I mean, how do we tackle the corruption issue and how that affects inequality both in the public and the private sector?
I have a problem with corruption, not just in the public sector. I think we tend to focus on the public sector, but actually it starts in the private sector. It is the private sector that starts to generate the wealth, and then it flows through in the public sector. I was with Mo Ibrahim earlier last week. Mo says, for every one public sector corruptee, there are 10 corruptors. How can we do it? It's shocking that many countries, and I think even in Sweden, not until recently has there been effective regulations and legislations for dealing with it. In the country that I work in, we still don't have adequate legislation to deal with private sector corruption. And so we're currently trying to work with the government to do that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you have to make sure you've got a proper judiciary, one which in itself is not corrupt. I was on a panel earlier this week where someone said that it's no good, paying for an expensive lawyer because it's cheaper to buy an expensive judge.
Wow.
So it runs right through the system, but you have to make sure you've got the right framework.
Joe, you probably have a lot to say on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of this is that when they take money corruptly, and particularly from Africa, the flow of corrupt money out of Africa is actually greater than the private investment into Africa. And Becky just came out with a big report on that. Where do they put the money? They put it in safe havens. Now, we talk about safe havens. We think of the Cayman Islands, the offshore, but we don't realize the largest safe havens are places like Delaware, places in the United States where we still have laws where you can put money and without being able to say who's the real beneficiary owner of it.
Yeah.
London, I mean, it's not just America. London is where all the money from Nigeria went.
Yeah.
And they can't get it out of Nigeria. We know that money is in Nigeria, but we can't get it back.
This is fascinating because you're really touching on a huge topic here. I mean, you're touching on the issues of the race to the bottom in terms of taxes. You're touching on the issues of what is the public sector there to do? What does the private sector owe? What portion of this? I mean, we know basically that we're living in a world roughly where the private sector is taking a larger share of wealth than in the past. The public sector is more beleaguered in terms of debt. There's this incredible sort of mismatch there that is contributing to this huge issue of inequality. So I know you hate this question because I'm always, journalists ask for silver bullets and there is none. But where would you start if we're gonna start with something that would change that power dynamic between the public and private sector? Where would you start?
Well, that's a really hard question. I guess I think where I would start is to try to understand that there are many of the key problems in our society that cannot be solved without some form of collective action. And our debate should be about the best way of delivering that collective action. So, for instance, without some form of regulation, we're going to have so much pollution that we won't be able to live.
Yeah.
there's no way that the private sector can have the incentive to deal with that. We know that there are very large numbers of people who are born too poor and families too poor to provide them an education.
Yeah.
So somehow, collectively, we will have to make sure that they get, we should make sure that they get the right education. Now, it will be partly the private sector, partly the public sector, partly, I think we ought to also emphasize the importance of, you might say, the third sector, the foundations, civil society, volunteer groups. And so even this division between public and private, I think is not really the quite right division. It oversimplifies the nature of our society.
Well, that's a very good point. And Hanne, maybe I'll ask you to jump in on this, because from where you're sitting, you're working for a foundation that is the offshoot of a very interesting and innovative company. So what of this resonates with you, and where do you see action levers that you could push?
Well, what we see in the LEGO Foundation, which is, by the way, sharing the mission with the LEGO Group, but they have absolutely no commercial interest or activities, what we see is that having this opportunity and the resource to really do long-term research, to make sure that different solutions for education are tested before we are asking public sector to implement it, makes a huge difference, because we actually do have the long-term perspective. We can take the long-term perspective as a foundation, and we can also invest in what it takes to really do that evidence base and get it right. And that makes a huge difference. You know, I was talking to Alice Albright yesterday morning, and she said that you would never ask somebody to introduce a drug that wasn't well tested, documented, and you knew that was working. And if you could imagine the same for education, that you would actually be able to say to a government or to a system, if you invest in this, it works like this and this and this, then I'm convinced myself that more money will flow both from private sector and from public sector into the really, really important area of education.
Okay.
The SDG 17 actually talks about partnerships.
Please.
And I think Joe is absolutely right. It's not one or other. We have to bring the public sector, the private sector, the NGOs, civil society activists together to deliver a lot of these problems, a lot of these solutions.
Okay, we're now basically 10 minutes away from our close, and we're going to take a few questions from Twitter, not just from the CGI community, but from the broader Twitterverse. I'm going to start, actually, since we're talking about investment, I'm going to start with a question about the unbanked. And how they might be able to get access to financial services, maybe through mobile technology, maybe through other areas. Bob, I'd love you to speak to that. And then Joe, I also want you to weigh in on whether or not more lending is what we need, and where. So Bob, you start.
So one of the things we're famous for is this thing called M-Pesa, mobile bank, mobile money. And mobile, the population of Kenya is about 43 million, of which half are adults. And we have 20 million who are M-Pesa customers, who are using this thing every day, who are moving more than $1 billion a day on M-Pesa. And we've moved it on from just being a person-to-person transfer to being able to borrow with dignity, because one of the problems of poor is that it costs so much to borrow. So they can borrow with dignity, and they can borrow at an affordable rate. They can save. People say that poor people don't want to save. It's just that they can't save because they don't have a bank account. And you do that through my mobile phone. And really, this is as complex as you need it to be. Starting to affect things like insurance. 2 days ago, the government of Kenya announced that you can now buy government bonds using mobile money. So it is a fantastic tool, which is much more accessible and much more affordable than the alternatives.
Joe, what do you think about the access to credit issue?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say, and compliment what they're doing. From an economic point of view, you can think of this as lowering transaction costs.
Oh, okay.
And modern technology has provided the ability to lower these kinds of transaction costs enormously. And what's so interesting is this is one of the areas where Africa has been the leader. Mm-hmm. This same modern technology is available in the United States, but because of the uncompetitive financial sector in the United States, we don't have access.
Technology hasn't lowered costs.
Technology is available, but if you want to move money from your bank account to your merchant's bank account, using even a debit card, it can be 1% or more, but the credit card, it could be 2, 3, 4%. And we had to have national legislation in the form of Dodd-Frank to bring it down. But even when we brought it down, we made a mistake. We entrusted the regulations to the Federal Reserve, which is under the influence of the banks, and they set a rate that was twice what their staff said, and their staff's rate was twice what it should have been.
Oh my gosh,
so we
layers
still have
and layers.
I love the complexity. I love the complexity of American society. It actually takes
Where there's complexity, there's
0.03
profits.
0.03 of a second to transfer money in Kenya. And
That's
what
amazing.
Jules
That is
fantastic.
amazing.
Yeah,
Well, that's a lesson. There's a
So
takeaway.
there's a real lesson we can learn from what's going on in Africa. I think it's about the competitive markets and how you can create barriers that make us suffer. Now, in terms of that portfolio of things that they do, one of the things that's really important is vehicles for savings. Because there's been too much emphasis on borrowing, getting in debt. And I think Americans of all people should know about the dangers of debt. But I think that's more generally true. Now, there's some kinds of debt that are good. And that was the original intent of microcredit. Eunice, BRAC, that you were talking about, and Grameen, it was to give money, access to money for investment. But then when that idea got translated, for instance, to India, it was access to credit for consumption. And you got developed in India's version of our subprime.
Yeah.
So I think what is important is to realize that debt can be good if it's for investment, and that's true at the government level and the private level.
And that's probably where regulation comes in.
And you need, exactly, and you need regulations because there's always a tendency to try to take advantage of poor people, particularly if they're not well educated. And, unfortunately, some people have given into that tendency, and some people, some companies have resisted that temptation.
That's interesting. All right. There was a question actually earlier about how we can make, I'm going to shift gears for a minute here, how we can make women's health issues and women's empowerment in general, which I think we've all seen the research and know is very much linked to broader economic growth and lowering inequality. How we can make that not just a women's issue, but a human issue, and an issue that businesses everywhere want to take on. So maybe, Hanne, do you have a thought about that?
Well, I would say it is already a human issue and a growth issue. It's simply, many children come into this world are malnourished when they are born, because the women are the ones that eat last and least. So even they are coming back to the loss of capacity with children if they don't have the right nutrition from the start. There's a very good business case for investing in the rights of women. Also, if you can access your basic right, as you just said, we all know these statistics. The family will thrive, the economic well-being of that family will be improved, and the children will simply do better. So investing in those rights for women quite often starts a cycle out of poverty, which affect the whole society.
Bob, I want to ask you, in Africa in particular, I'm always struck by how entrepreneurial so many societies are across the board, but in particular, how many entrepreneurial women there are, running small businesses, being merchants, doing retail. You've talked about some of the ways that you're empowering people through technology, but how can women's entrepreneurial energy be harnessed, and how can the private sector help with that?
In tons of ways. If you take the agricultural sector, for example, most agriculturalists in Africa are women. And they're small scale, very small scale. And so we look at mobile phones and say, how can we help them? And we can help them by giving them better information. So we've worked with a company called Green Dreams in Kenya to develop a thing called iCow. And iCow delivers information on how to look after your cow, and now your chickens and your pigs and everything else. And that is yielding an improvement of up to 50% in yield. So that's one way.
That's interesting.
Giving them information, giving them market information.
If you could be futuristic for a minute, if you could imagine an inequality app, something that you would invent or that you wish existed that could address this problem, what would it look like?
I bring you back to my phone. It's not about apps. It's actually using
About text.
it's about text. Because 80% of my customers are using these phones. And so we try not to be too overcomplicated. But the most important thing for us is really, really deeply understanding the customer and understanding what is going to transform their lives. Because that's what actually drives our company along. It's not how much profit can we generate. And we do generate a reasonable amount of profit. But we say, how can we transform their lives? How can we make life better for that customer? And the answer, pretty much 80% of the time, sits in this little yellow phone. I can give this to you when we're done.
I would love that. Actually, my daughter would love that. She likes to text. Joe, maybe you have thoughts on the issue of women's empowerment, making that a human issue rather than just a women's issue, and what it could do for inequality in general.
I guess the way I would put it is the following, that the big issue is making sure that everybody has access to basic rights, and from nutrition to education. Viewing these as universal issues, all of these issues, and, it's African Americans, it's women, and if we realize that every individual, and women are people too, and so that every group is entitled, then we start approaching all these issues as human issues. I want to go back to the point that you mentioned, this report that we had, rewriting the rules and realizing that what goes on in our society is not just the result of inevitable, inexorable economic forces, but of the way we write the rules, of other decisions, the way we structure our societies. And that's why, as you mentioned in the beginning of your talk, 70% of people are in societies where their inequality is growing, but there's 30% where that's not true. And what's the difference? Are there different economic laws in one group versus the other? No, there's not differences in economic laws. It's the choices they've made and how they've written the rules. We still have, in the United States, high levels of gender discrimination. And even after we've outlawed them, but we haven't taken as strong a proactive approach to making sure that gender discrimination is eliminated.
Well, and that, this report, everybody should read it if they haven't, because it's amazing. But, this goes to the question that issues of inequality, issues of economic growth are so interconnected with health policy, with education policy. This isn't just about, Dodd-Frank in a silo over here or access to healthcare over here. It's about connecting those dots. And I think that you made the important point that we shouldn't necessarily be looking for an easy and quick solution, because it took us 40 years to sort of get here, if you look at the data, and it's going to take a while to get out of this situation, and that we can rewrite the rules of capitalism. And maybe on that note, we've got only a couple minutes left. I'm going to ask everybody to go down. Which rule would you rewrite right now to help fix the inequality issue? In 30 seconds. How about that?
I would like to rewrite the informal rule many, many places in this world that women and young women should not speak up. That they should simply they should be encouraged to raise their voice and find their feet and find their self-confidence that they can make a difference.
Bob, which rule would you rewrite?
I mean, I would absolutely legalize the need for gender equity. It has to be 50-50.
Joe, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, well, I think they've actually hit it on the nail. I think those are examples, and I think we have to make sure that in every aspect of our society, education, nutrition, that those principles are being enacted. So it's not just words, but that we actually live up to those words. We passed laws against discrimination 40 years ago, and we know that's money that have continued. So that what we really have to do is make sure we have the rules to enforce the rules.
And that there are repercussions when they're not.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I think that is a good note of action on which to end. That's what CGI likes. So thank you all. Thank you for the panel, and thank you guys for being here.